So there's still someone in 2024 who doesn't realize that Final Fantasy VII is a metaphor about corporate greed and environmentalism 30 years after the game came out. Okay. I stumbled across this exchange on Twitter, and I was gonna let it go, but the more I thought about it, the more I wanted to respond, and I couldn't do it in a single tweet. Someone tweeted about this article from The Gamer titled, "Final Fantasy Creator Says Games Need to Be Political," and the person said to this, "No." And then someone responded to that, saying, quote, "Final Fantasy VII is literally about a bunch of eco-terrorists fighting a gigantic corporation draining the planet of his life energy. The dweebs know nothing about the video game they pretend to want to defend." Which is correct. Final Fantasy VII is 27 years old, so by now it should be obvious to anyone who's played the game that the game has a very particular message. There are a group of people online, mostly on the right, who reflexively reject any games, or really any media, that has a political angle, unless it aligns to their politics, then they really don't care. This has become so common that it's taken on a life of its own. It's now a narrative, one that can't be challenged or questioned, and one people will shout with a quickness without ever thinking about what they're saying. That's how I stumbled onto this person who responded to the previous comment, saying, quote, "A game having in-world politics is not the issue. Is Mako real? Is the live stream real? Tell me you know nothing about metaphors without telling me you know nothing about metaphors." For those who don't know, like this guy, a metaphor is defined as, quote, "a figure of speech in which a word or a phrase, literally denoting one kind of object or idea, is used in place of another to suggest a likeness or analogy between them." In stories, a metaphor can encompass a line, a theme, or the entire story itself. Many stories use metaphors to talk about real-world topics to make broader points about them without getting caught up in the minutiae of real-world issues, and to avoid triggering people like this guy, who seem to take great offense whenever anyone challenges their political ideas. Final Fantasy VII is an example of this. The story is about a bunch of eco-terrorists fighting a megacorporation draining the planet's life energy. It becomes much deeper than that as the story progresses, but that is the basis of the story. It's clearly a metaphor about corporations' exploitation of Earth's resources and the future impact their actions will have on the environment and the global population. It's so painfully obvious, you could almost argue it's too on the nose. I don't understand how anyone who played Final Fantasy VII could fail to see this. The game isn't trying to hide its message. It's not subtle, it's not nuanced, it whacks you in the face with a buster sword with its anti-corporation, pro-environmentalist message. That said, if someone were right-leaning, as this guy appears to be, I can see why they would pretend the game's message is specifically about the in-game fictional world with no connection to the real world. The game's message and the hero's goals don't align with conservative positions, so there would be an inherent problem because many people have a hard time accepting that everyone doesn't share their political views. Don't take my word for it, take this guy's word for it. Quote, "A game basically featuring Antifa and or telling you how terrible of a person you are if you don't respect pronouns, / believe trans people are real is a totally different story and is essentially what we are getting in modern day." Right. So, 2 points. 1, for the love of God, unclench. Being this tightly wound, believing that trans people are a figment of imagination, being that uptight, that's going to lead to colon cancer. Relax. 2, that's not what Hironobu Sakaguchi, the creator of Final Fantasy, actually said. Unlike this guy, I read the Gamer article, which linked back to an inverse interview, where Sakaguchi said about what defines a Final Fantasy game, quote, "If I had to give some kind of core ingredient, I would say it's the story and the world. These are a must for any Final Fantasy, and the common denominator across all of them. The world setting needs to contain some kind of thematic element that is loosely tied to current events. I think the world itself needs to have some kind of thematic backbone or message that gives a different perspective or a thought-provoking prompt for players." It would have taken all of 5 seconds to look this up, but that would go against the narrative that this guy and other politically motivated content creators have adopted in recent years, that anything that doesn't align to their political views or comes from the left is automatically bad. That creates a problem for them because Final Fantasy VII is clearly left-leaning in its message and themes, but they also like, or at least claim to like, the game. So what to do? Well, the easiest thing to do is claim that there's some distinction between in-game and real-world politics. Quote, Games injecting real-world identity politics is a massive problem and is not comparable to telling a fake story with fake in-game politics that fit the narrative of the world that it's made in. Okay, sure, fine, whatever. I just have one pesky technical question. Where do the storytellers get the ideas for the fake in-game politics? Might they not be inspired by real-world politics? Might they not be inspired, like other creators, by their own life experiences? For example, let's say some guy went to war, and during that war he lost all but a handful of his close friends. Let's say that he was later horrified by the reality that this war came down to numbers on a table with no real concern for the men and boys losing their lives. Would it be improper for this guy, let's call him John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, to include his opinion about people reducing war to simple bureaucratic machinations in his works? Or would that be getting too political? When people say things like keep politics out of stories, they reveal that they don't know the first thing about storytelling or even where inspiration comes from. The idea that talking about real-world issues is off limits in stories would rob us of many of Shakespeare's greatest plays, some of the best novels ever written, some of the best films and TV shows ever made, and scores of classic video games like Final Fantasy VII. Let's just stick to movies. If we followed this guy's suggestion that we keep real-world politics out of stories, there goes Apocalypse Now, Full Metal Jacket, The Killing Fields, Schindler's List, Saving Private Ryan, Shawshank Redemption, Dog Day Afternoon, Hotel Rwanda, City of God, Malcolm X, and Patton, just to name a few. People tell stories based on what they know and what interests them. Sometimes that means they delve into politics. To say real-world politics should be off-limits in stories strips us of one of the few means we have to understand and address those issues. Yes, that means sometimes people will express different political views. That's a good thing. Some people could benefit from hearing a different political perspective. Otherwise, they might say silly things like this, quote, "Please do not use good stories of the past to try to push a narrative of games were always political because you are full of shit and you know you are being disingenuous because the two are not comparable at all." Full of shit and disingenuous. That's a very poor choice of words for someone with a stone in hand surrounded by a house of glass. Dude wraps up with this, quote, "Please call me a tourist in Final Fantasy. I would love to hear it." I don't know if this guy is a tourist, and I don't care. I do know that when it comes to storytelling, he doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about. I also understand. People like this guy don't like their worldview being challenged, especially when it comes from people they consider to be beneath them, like people on the left. However, most creative people tend to lean to the left, so this presents a problem for right-leaning people like this guy because they hate anyone left of center and can't stop telling you that. Yet they also like, or claim to like, a lot of the stuff those evil lefties create. Their solution is to pretend the stories aren't political, and when that doesn't work, to demand that the stories be stripped of all politics, neither of which makes any sense. It's not how people tell stories. People write what they know and what interests them, and eventually, that's bound to be something political, and that shouldn't be off limits. That said, there is such a thing as going too far. When people become so obsessed with their politics that they can't see past them, that every single piece of minutia must check the right box, the stories, if you can even call them that, suffer for it. At that point, they're not stories. They're diatribes shouted from soapboxes for backpats, and yeah, they suck. The solution to fixing that, however, isn't to do what this guy says and get rid of politics, or really get rid of left-leaning politics, in stories. It's to tell the people telling the bad stories to knock it the fuck off. The problem isn't politics in entertainment. The problem is the way people write about politics. Fix that, and, well, people like this guy would still be unhappy because you're talking about things they don't like. But you will fix the overall problem with modern stories. However, bitching about Final Fantasy VII being an obvious metaphor for real-world politics just because they don't align to your own makes you look silly and like a tourist. But what do I know? I'm just some guy.